Welcome everybody to this session. I am Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group, and we are one of the organizers of this session called What Counts in Deciding Who Feeds the World. We are very grateful to the organizers of the Oxford Real Farming Conference for allowing this space to discuss this really important question. And we are also very grateful to COATI, the collective of interpreters that will help us with translation. As you know, there is translation to Spanish and French, so you can use, you can see in the chat the instructions in case you have any doubt about that. I would like to share just my screen now. Okay, so we will have in this session we will have we will have three speakers. Pat Mooney, which is the founder of ETC Group and also an expert at IPES Food, the international panel for expert on sustainable food systems. And then we will have Henk Hobbelink from Grain and Ruth Hancock from the Land Workers Alliance and La Via Campesina. And we think that this issue is particularly important and is particularly vital because it is about what, who, how, and at what cost food is produced and consumed. And these are questions that are vital for not only for this conference, but for every one of us, because we all need to eat, but also because this is at the center. Who are really the actors of this are at the center of the policies at national and international level that are done and that influence our lives. And Grain, ETC, and La Via Campesina, who are part of this conference today, representative of all these organizations, we have been working for several years on the issue, and we will be referring in this conference to two of our main resources. One is the report Who Will Feed Us, that was coordinated by ETC Group. And it's, as the subtitle says, it is about the peasant food web versus the industrial food chain. It's a lot of questions, for instance, who cares for biodiversity, what happened with health, with environment, who produces the food and who consumes the food, and these kind of questions. We had the first version in 2009, and then we did an updated one in 2013 and in 2017. And there is another key document, which is called Hungry for Land, that was produced by Grain, about how much land what is called small farmers, small-scale farmers have. And it showed that the small farmers feed the world with less than a quarter of all farmland. Basically, the key messages in these two reports together is that peasants are the main or sole food providers to more than 70% of the world's people. And what we in ETC call as the peasant web, which includes peasants, small-scale farmers, fishers, pastoralists, urban growers, small-scale gathering and handling, produce this food with less than 25% of the resources, including land, water, and fossil fuels used to get all of the world's food to the table. The industrial food chain uses at least 75% of the world's agricultural resources, but it's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions and provides food to only the equivalent of 30% of the world's people. These are kind of the key messages of these reports. We now in this conference want to refer to articles that has been published in the last few years, but particularly a very concerning FAO recent research that in both cases question these figures, but also try attempts to say that small farmers only are the main food provider for maybe a third of the world population, and there is a big gap on these two statements. So the two articles that we refer to that we want to debate in this conference are, one is made by Sarah Lauder and other, and it's called "Which Farms Feed the World and Has Farmland Become More Concentrated?" And you can see the link on screen just now. And the other one is a prior paper that was published in 2018 by Vincent Ricciardi, Navin Ramankuti, and others. And it was published in Global Food Security in 2019, and it's called "How Much of the World's Food Do the Smallholder Produce?" We are concerned about this not by so to say academic reasons, but because of the real impact that this may have on the recognition and the support of small food providers and peasants all over the world, the peasant web, and the support that it needs when it is really under threat through many different threats. So I won't describe in which way we are interpreting and debating these studies, because that is what Pat, Mooney, and Henk and Ruth will do now, following this one. So I will just say that our first speaker, Pat Mooney, is the co-founder and former executive director of ETC Group, and is a very recognized expert on agricultural diversity, on biotechnology, and on global governance. He has been working and has decades of experience in international negotiations, but also in working with different movements and civil society. And he has several awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. Along with the ETC Group team, Pat Mooney led the research that resulted in the publication of the document "Who Will Feed Us?", that effectively put on the international debate that the peasant web is who provides the food of the majority of the world population. So I will now leave the floor for Pat to explain this. Pat?
Oxford Real Farm meeting is allowing us to have this time as well. Originally, when we started to do this work, looking at who will feed us, it was genuinely a search on the part of a sector group to try to understand the importance of peasant food production, the peasant food web, to the whole world food situation. It was an exploration, and our 2009 report really shows that. As we moved along, we were surprised by what we were learning. We were surprised that not only was the peasant food web vital in terms of its knowledge and its access to seeds and breeds of livestock and so on as critical for long-term food security and even short-term food security, but that as we studied it, it became clear to us that not only were peasants vital to everybody's food security, including industrial food chains production, certainly, but also that peasants were producing, I think, more food, frankly, than we really thought, and again, more critically important to the daily requirements of people in the world than we had actually anticipated. So we evolved over the 3 studies up to 2017 in our own exploration of these issues and got greater clarity to it. From 2009 through to 2017, our studies, though, still came out with roughly the same assumption or conclusions, which was that no matter how you look at it, about 70% of the world's people really depend upon peasant food production and provision to survive. And that's really extraordinarily important today, but is in fact going to be more important in the future. The title of the report again was "Who Will Feed Us?" It's looking into the future. Who is best positioned, the industrial food chain or peasants, to actually get us to safer places in a time of climate change and all the biodiversity loss that we're facing today. And our conclusion again was that by any way you'd look at it, peasants are absolutely the best able to get us to a safer place. And so the 70% that they provide today may become much more important, or even a larger percentage in the future. Then just in the last couple of years, well, that was, I think the reports were well received, and FAO, in fact, in an earlier administration of FAO, supported what we were saying in broad strokes. Suddenly we started to see reports coming out that were criticizing our figures. One, as you've mentioned already, Silvia, was by Riccardi and colleagues, who directly challenged our 70% figure and concluded that it was, again, roughly about a third of the food was being produced by peasants, and that's all. And they described themselves as mythbusters, and were quite rather aggressively, I think, attacking our positions. And then that was picked up by FAO, and the timing was kind of interesting. A new administration came into FAO, and at that time, FAO was preparing for what they called, or what UN called, a food summit. I don't think I'd grace it with that kind of language. Last year, and a report came out from FAO, again, as you've identified, Silvia, from Lauder and Friends, that didn't really talk about our study, but again, built upon the Riccardi study, and argued that again, peasants produce at the most about a third of the world's food. So I want to just describe some of the real differences in the studies and why those figures are so different. And I'd encourage everybody to go back and read them. But one is, of course, is the definition of who we're talking about, who is a peasant, or as Lauder and Ricciardi talk about, smallholder producers or smallholders. Who are they? And in the Ricciardi, both studies, the assumption really is that smallholder producers are people with land, farmers only, who are growing land and using 2 hectares or less of the per producer, per family farmer. So they have a description that's size related, and it assumes that the peasants are growing food on land, crops, and a little bit of livestock related to that, but not much. Whereas our report, Who Will Feed Us, talks about peasants very clearly and distinctly, saying that peasants are artisanal fishers as well as smallholder producers on land, on farms. They're also hunters and gatherers. They're also urban growers, as you mentioned, pastoralists, all of that range of production activities and provisioning activities beyond simply the ownership of 2 hectares of land. And so it was really kind of an apples and oranges distinction that we were being criticized for having a figure of 70%, where theirs was, again, 1/3 kind of category, based upon a different description of who we're talking about. What's concerning about that is really what FAO has done in the Lauder report, because FAO and IFAD together, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, in preparation for the work on the decade of family farming, described family farmers as such, regardless of how much land, as those who were also fishers and pastoralists and the whole range of activities, pretty much as we describe in Who Will Feed Us. So their definition of a smallholder in that sense as well was much wider than FAO was reporting in the Lauder report. So they went against FAO's own terminology and that of the United Nations in general, including IFAD, of course, in giving us this very narrow description of who is a peasant or a smallholder producer, as they use that language. And again, they really confine themselves to this 2 hectare description, and Grain has been very clear, and we depended very much on Grain's report, and Henk can speak to that as well, of course, that that's not a fair definition, that depending on slope, depending on soil, depending upon climate, depending on all kinds of factors, smallholder producers could have 2 hectares or 5 hectares of land. It's really a self-identification as to what they consider themselves to be, who considers themselves to be a peasant, and how countries describe that. But if you take across the board, roughly, country definitions, as opposed to an arbitrary definition by Lauder or Ricciardi, then we're talking about roughly 25% of the land, a bit less probably than 25% of all the farmland is really produced by smallholder production. And that really changed the dynamics in terms of how much food we're talking, even in terms of crop production. And if you take, if we all worked from a rough figure of an average of about 5 hectares and lower for those who are producing crops, we end up with, and there's general agreement on this, we'd end up with about 50% of crop production being produced by what we call peasants, smallholder producers. So we're still not at 70%, we're still just at 50%. But if we then take into account artisanal fishers, we take into account hunters and gatherers, we take into account pastoralists, and we take into account urban production, urban and peri-urban farming, then we do get to the 70% figure again. In fact, it's probably a little bit higher than 70% of even food that's produced would seem to be coming from peasants. What is clearer than just the production figures is the provisioning importance here, because at least 70% of the world's people depend upon smallholder producers or peasants for their food. So it's not just a matter of how much food is being produced, but how much of it is actually getting to people and actually meeting their needs. And I think Henk's going to talk about what happens to the industrial food chains of food and why it is that they're providing so little food for people, as it turns out. But so there was a distinction here that's a real problem about who is a peasant, and also a debate over, again, what size of land that is, and then how much of that food that is being produced is actually making it to feed people in a nutritious kind of way. And all of those three categories, which are not addressed, that last one especially is not being addressed by the FAO study or by the Ricciardi study. They just ignore that kind of issue of what gets to people. If we look at that, then again, the peasant role is much more important. Beyond those considerations, I'm alarmed by the FAO report in that it concludes that there's an inordinate amount of policy attention being given to peasants and not enough attention being given to large farmers, whom they see as being the backbone of food production in the world and in the future. Now, there's no data that backs that statement up. They simply make the assumption that somehow the world is focused upon peasants and not focused on the industrial food chain. I think that most everybody joining us in this discussion today would agree that that's just not the case, that the vast majority of policymaker interest and financial resources in agriculture are going to support and subsidize the industrial food chain, and the focus is on large farms, not small farms, and large fishing trawlers, not artisanal fishers, and so on. So that alarms me too, that the paper is actually, in the end, the FAO paper is a strategy to reduce the importance of peasants in the world food system at a time when they're still more important than ever, and to refocus the interests of the international agricultural community on on supporting small or large farmer production rather than dealing with small farmers. And that's a dangerous assumption, and we have to really fight against that, I think, as we try to look at how we're going to feed ourselves in the future. And again, that is the big issue for us. It is who will feed us in the decades ahead, who is best positioned to do that. And I think we'll have time to talk about that as we go on. But just as a really important point for me, at least, as we looked at the figures, is that the kind of industrial food chain strategy for the future is they will argue that they can support closer supply chains, shorter supply chains than in the past. They say they've learned that lesson from the pandemic. But when they say that, they're actually adding a whole new layer of controls and actually a longer supply chain than in the past, because they're proposing to feed the world in the future through systems such as satellite systems and data management systems and so on that are not controlled locally, requiring inputs for production which are not available locally, and again, under intellectual property conditions and even repair, as we're familiar with, conditions, which will make it harder for local production to meet the needs of local people. So it's the opposite of what they're saying, and that concerns us, that the future strategy of the industrial food chain is to actually extend supply chains, make it harder for local production and local markets, and that jeopardizes all of us in the decades ahead. I think that's probably enough to start us, Silvia, and I know we'll have lots of time, I hope, for discussion later on, and I'll turn it over to you again.
Thank you very much, Pat. Yeah, I think you have done really important points, particularly as you said that there are two or three very important questions here. One is that not only who is already providing the food, but also who is best fitted and will provide the food we need. And as we come back from different angles all the time, it's still the peasant web, and it's still the majority of those. And in the light of this, but also in the light of so many hardships and threats to peasants, it's extremely concerning that FAO claims as its own research a paper that tries to defend the industrial food chain, saying that they have got less attention than small food providers, when in the reality, well, no, it has been the opposite for many decades. I will let now Henk Hobbelink continue with this argumentation. And for those of us who asked, there is in the chat the reference to the studies that we have been mentioning. Henk Hobbelink is an agronomist, and he's the co-founder and the coordinator of GRAIN. And GRAIN is a small international collective that has existed for over 30 years, and that works to support small farmers and movements in their struggle for community control and biodiversity-based food systems and for food sovereignty. GRAIN has also been at the forefront of documenting and denouncing the rapidly accelerating phenomena of land grabbing. For this work, GRAIN received the Right Livelihood Award also in 2011. And I leave now the floor to Henk.
Thank you, Silvia, and hello, everybody. Thank you, Pat, for the good introduction. I think that lays out the field quite well. One thing I would like to talk about, as Pat was already saying, more about what FAO now claims feeds 70% of the world, the large farmers. But before I do that, I would like to add one thing to what Pat was saying about what we're very concerned about in the FAO report, is that it seems that the FAO has shifted a very long history of claiming that small farmers are actually more productive than large farmers. That has been shown in numerous studies. It's there, and in the report now, they claim to say that there's no difference between small and large-scale farmers, and that reinforces an argument that agribusiness always uses, that small farms are more productive, are more efficient, and therefore are better food producers than small farmers. But if you look at what these big farmers actually produce, it's quite telling that a lot of it is not about food production. If you look at the statistics, where the different foods come from, they produce food, they produce crops that you either can't eat, like the plantation crops, rubber, cotton, etc. They produce ingredients for processed food that are bad for health, like palm oil, soybeans, sugar. Or they produce animal feed and biofuels, like maize and soybeans. That's where the majority of their production is focused on, not on healthy food. There's an interesting study by Emily Cassidy and others, which calculates that only 55 globally, only 55 of the crop calories feed people directly, meaning is directly used for food that humans eat. 36% goes to livestock as animal feed, and the rest to biofuels. In countries where large farmers dominate, like the United States, the situation is far worse. About 27% of the crop calories produced in the US feed people directly. 27%. The vast majority, 2/3, 67% to be precise, goes to animal feed. I don't want to overwhelm you with too many figures and data, but if you look at the contrast, for example, a country like India, where small farmers are dominating, the situation is quite different. About 90% of all the crop calories produced go to food eaten by humans. 6% is for feed. So the contrast is quite startling. You could argue that, well, these large farmers who produce feed for animals indirectly also feed humans, as the people eat the meat. But again, there is a tremendous factor of difference, because meat and dairy are an extremely inefficient way of producing food. Only some 12% of the animal feed calories, according to the same study I was talking about before by Emily Cassidy and others, and end up contributing to the human diet. So that it's 3% in the case of beef. So there's a tremendous loss of energy, calories, and food production there. The crops for biofuels and animal feed are mostly produced by large farmers. The crops produced for humans are mostly produced, depending on the country where we're talking about, by small farmers. I would like to, if I can, share a map which was published in National Geographic, which shows actually where the food is produced. It shows the land, the amount of land being used for food production versus the amount of land used to produce animal feed and fuel and biofuel. So you can clearly see a situation here where, again, in the global north, especially in the United States, and in Europe, and in parts of China, there is the dominant land use is to produce crops for feed and fuel. While you look in Africa and central and certain parts of South America, India, for example, strongly, the land use is really for food, for humans. The conclusion of this, the conclusion is then, a conclusion you could draw is really that it's the small farmers who produce the food, and it's the large farmers who produce commodities, agriculture commodities. Something that same study I was talking about before also showed, and they sort of, in that study, the authors argue that we should stop talking about tons per hectare as a way to measure productivity, and we should start talking about how many people are being nurtured per hectare. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And these authors, they started making some calculations, and they came to the conclusion that in the US, only 5.2 people per hectare are being fed, while in countries like China, 8.4 people are being fed, and in India, 5.6. So the US produces less food for people than countries like India and China. I would leave that discussion there for a moment, and would like to talk a little bit about another aspect which is often not talked about if we talk about industrial farming and big farms. Big farms not only don't feed the world, but they also create climate chaos. We did a report last year about where we looked at fertilizer use together with Greenpeace and IATP, and the conclusion there was that about that fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, cause about 2.4% of all the global emissions of climate gases. That amounts to more than 20% of all the emissions by agriculture and by the food system. An important part of that is because of the production of the fertilizers, and another part is when it's being used in the field by the farmers. Synthetic fertilizer use has been increased by 800% in the 1960s, and the FAO calculates that in the coming years it will increase a further 50%. So the industrial farmers, who are the ones who use most of the fertilizer, are the ones who produce the climate crisis from the side of agriculture. I think it's important to realize that, because they not only are producing for an industrial sector, which is part and not the food, but they are also causing the climate, the emissions from the climate in which are an important part responsible from the food sector and from agriculture. In addition, the using of fertilizer is a bit of a vicious circle. The longer you use it, the more the soil gets degraded, the soil loses organic matter, and the more fertilizers you have to use. So the way it is being presented, that the industrial farming, the big farmers, produce more food and do it more efficiently, is not correct. If I can, I will just to wrap up, show another map, which shows, talking about fertilizer, the amount of CO2 equivalent and climate gases are being produced by, are being emitted per capita. And if you look at this map, it's again, if you remember the map I showed first, I found it quite striking that the intensity of the emissions.
We cannot see the map. Are you showing the map?
Sorry, you have to share screen. Hold on.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I was saying that this map shows again. This map shows the amount of emissions from fertilizer, from nitrogen fertilizer, in different countries in the world per capita, and it's quite striking. It's the usual. If you look at the countries, it's those countries who produce where the most dominant agriculture, industrial agriculture farming, big farmers. And it's also the maps. It's almost an overlay of the map I showed before, where the biofuels and where the other crops not for food, not for human food, are being produced. So you have again the United States, you have Europe, Australia in this case, and the export countries of South America who are dominating there. So again, I think this shows quite clearly, and I would like to write up with it, that first, big farms don't feed the world. They feed the pockets of investors and commodity traders. They feed the inputs from highly processed, and highly processed food, junk food industry, and they feed cars and cows. That would be my conclusion. I would like to leave it here to have enough space for discussion afterwards, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henk. You made this excellent summary, absolutely. And I would like to mention one thing that there is in the Lauder report that is connected to what both Pat and Henk said, is that even if then they say that farmers, small farmers, whatever they call it, which is very confusing in the Lauder paper, which is the FAO research paper, they say that farmers under 2 hectares have 12% of the land, if I remember right, but they produce 35% of the food. So even by FAO report measures, they are enormously, small farmers, small food providers, enormously more productive than large farms. then additionally, as Henk said, don't produce food. They produce mainly commodities. And as I saw a question in the chat that was speaking about biofuels, I would like to say that Henk referred to industrial agrofuels, so he doesn't refer to small scale biofuels, but we can sort out later in the questions. And I will now like to give the floor to Ruth Hancock. And Ruth Hancock is an agroecological vegetable farmer based in Devon in the UK. And she founded and has been the lead grower at Fresh and Garden, which is a 5-acre market garden in East Devon since it started 20 years ago. Also, for the last 7 years, she has been a member of the coordination team of the Land Workers Alliance, which is a member of La Via Campesina, which at present is the largest network of campesino farmers in the world. And I am really very pleased to give the floor to Ruth to listen to the perspective from the real small farmers, or peasants, as we call it in other places. I know in the UK you don't call yourself peasants, but it's also another concept definition that we could agree on what is the best way of using. Ruth, you have the floor.
Thank you, Silvia. It's very interesting, the question around language around being a peasant, because I am a peasant farmer, but peasant is still used as a pejorative term against people considered to be, a bit rural and unintelligent. Anyway, that's a debate for another time. So, as Silvia says, I'm an agroecological vegetable and egg farmer in East Devon, and I've been running the farm here with quite a lot of help from other people as well. And yeah, I've been productive in terms of feeding a large section of my community, but also I'm an economic farmer in terms that I make a living from this, and I pay the mortgage on the land. I'm a startup farmer. So with my partner, we bought the land and set up the business, and now we live here. And I make my principal living from producing vegetables to sell to the local community. And as Silvia said, I'm also part of the Land Workers Alliance, and we're a grassroots union of agroecological farmers, fisherfolk, foresters and fibre producers. So the quadruple Fs. We do actually have a couple of fisherfolk in our membership now, and we're a member organisation of La Via Campesina too. So yeah, I've read the report, the Ricciardi report, and in many ways it surprised me and almost buoyed me up, because in the way that they're trying to promote the idea that large farms are more significant, and I think it is very funny the way that there's this false victimhood of like, oh, us poor larger farmers and industrial agriculture is not being given a fair crack of the whip. It's just having spent quite a lot of time campaigning through LWA for more attention from our agricultural department, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And it's only in the last few years that we've really had any kind of hearing from that department. So the idea that the poor beleaguered industrial food system is not getting a fair hearing and doesn't get the chance to do vastly more lobbying than we do is really, it's almost quite funny if it didn't have such troubling consequences. So, I mean, as agroecologists, we're already running human-scaled, biodiverse, productive farms. We already have the tools, the methodologies, and the knowledge to look after our soils. We feed people really well as well. And I think this is a key thing in the report, is not just how many calories are we producing, as if we're just putting crude fuel into the tanks of engines. And that's not how you feed people. That's not really nutrition, is it? And we're doing all that, and we're doing it securely alongside our ecosystems. In fact, we see ourselves as part of the ecosystem of our farm and the ecosystem of our wider community. And as a result of that, really, we reject these false solutions, which are currently being promoted by biotech corporations. And if we can just have a few barriers removed from what we're already doing. So certainly from a UK perspective, when we look at barriers to agroecology and more small farms existing, then we often come up against the problem of access to land and access to finance, access to training, access to secure markets, these things repeated. I'm sure everyone or most people on this call will identify with these barriers. And then of course, in other countries, agroecologists have other barriers to their workings, but still, despite all that, you know, the Ricciardi report is still, I still find it very, very encouraging. The fact that despite all these barriers, we are feeding people, and we're feeding people well as a result. So looking at the report, it's who in fact stands to benefit from this narrative that downplays the value of small farms, and without tipping over into paranoia or conspiracy theories, one might surmise that this could be seen as a sort of softening up exercise that seeks to skew policy making decisions away from agroecology, although we'd only just really got our place at the table to talk about agroecology and for it to be recognized more in the wider world as a very valuable system of producing food. So why, you know, what is this instinct to skew away from agroecology and back towards agribusiness? Not that, you know, we could even say that it hadn't ever gone away from agribusiness, but why it's almost as if there's a fear of this final recognition of what we as peasant farmers do. Because, you know, in truth, agribusiness still has the majority of lobbying power. You know, the biotech companies, they, you know, they're seen as sort of commercially, profitably important, whereas small-scale peasant farmers, we don't really have that kind of voice. We're kind of busy on our farms feeding people. We don't really get that many opportunities to go to our administration and say, look, this is what we're doing, and trying to show figures of what we're doing, because we are so diverse. So really measuring what we do is quite difficult, and I give great credit to organizations who are actually doing that, ETC particularly. But so yeah, the majority of the lobbying power is still with the industrial food system. But have they seen the writing on the wall? That's maybe, you know, this is potentially part of the problem. So they've seen the writing on the wall for oil-based agriculture, chemical agriculture. They see that this model cannot continue. So now there's this seeking to reinvent through biotech and data harvest and synthetic foodstuffs, you know, sort of vegan foodstuffs. And it made me think back to when I was at Agricultural College. I did a conventional agricultural 3-year qualification and national diploma in agriculture. And at the time, this was the late 80s, a lot of our classroom materials were, they had a little logo in the bottom corner with ICI written on it, because we were told things such as, your soil is just a substrate in which to stand your plant roots up in whilst you feed your crops from a bag, courtesy of ICI. So it's just made me think, so going forward, the teaching materials for the agricultural colleges from now on, is that going to be the Bill Gates Foundation? Is it going to be Microsoft? So it just seems like another way of trying to capture back the goodness out of the system, basically, rather than us producing food and feeding our community. There's this extractive industrial model that's trying to somehow find a way in, and this report is troubling in that it potentially gives this false narrative, which will then allow this extractive agribusiness to get in. And we would argue that these false solutions, they're unsafe, they're unnecessary, they run counter to all the things that we hold dear, such as food sovereignty, food justice, land justice, equitable, ecological, and secure food production and distribution. Especially, we're already showing how much food we already can produce on even a relatively small proportionate acreage of global farmland. You know, if we've only got 12% of global farmland, and of course, how do we measure that? And we are producing, even as the report says, or is trying to downgrade us to 30%. It's like, that's a tremendous amount of food, considering all the barriers that we face. Just imagine what we could do if we didn't have those barriers. It's, you know, it's, as I say, I was expecting to be downcast by this report, but really, if you read it correctly, it's saying we're doing very well already, and we could do an awful lot better with a bit more support from our governments and other agencies. You know, why not more facilitation of agroecology rather than less? So yeah, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points that jump out at me. Yeah?
Yeah, sorry. No, I was just going to say that you have like 3 more minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, measuring calorific output. It's such an unsophisticated metric, because we know calories are not about food in the sense of nutrition. Calories are there, you know, it's just a fuel thing, and the measuring of just calorific output per hectare, per acre just seems so unsophisticated when you look at the diverse range of crops that we're producing on our farms. I mean, and the built-in resilience that we have. For instance, here I'm growing in excess of 60 different crops. So there's always a large range of nutritious food available. So one crop doesn't work, another crop can come in on its place. So but all this requires people to operate it, people and knowledge. And then again, as Pat and Henk were saying, add into all this these foodstuffs and production models, which are even outside of the commercial food system. I would say, yes, I'm in the commercial food system. I do this to make a living, but all the foodstuffs from outside of that system, from pastoralists and fisherfolk. And then we can look at the processing, the adding value. So when people are fermenting foods, all the nutrition that comes from that as well. And the metric for the small farm. I mean, I consider myself, I'm on a small farm on 5 hectares, but the metric of under 2 hectares from a European perspective, because in the European and Western Europe and the BRIC countries, a farm under 2 hectares is quite rare. So if that's how we're measuring, and even those small farms are still producing 30% of our food, because this study didn't include a lot of the global south, it shows what a tremendous success we are. So I would argue that, yeah, as agroecologists, we're just proving our resilience during the pandemic, during the shocks after Brexit. Here at the farm, we just carried on producing food and feeding people. It was almost, people kept saying, "Oh, how are you doing? How are you managing?" It's like, we're just carrying on. And, you know, we've had an upswing in interest in what we're doing. And then, of course, we could go on and on and on, but, you know, this virtuous loop of, I produce food, I sell it to you, I get a fair price, you get nutritious food for a decent price. The only person who misses out or who loses out, the only people losing out by an agroecological food web are the people seeking to profit from extracting via expensive inputs, biotech, long supply chains. If they're taken out of the model, I can still feed you, you can still be fed by me. And okay, that might mean some of those jobs might be disappearing from biotech, but it's okay, because we can have lots more small farms and people can come and have meaningful and satisfying work working alongside us. So I think it's, yeah, I think, you know, although there's so much to challenge, and I really appreciate that that's what people are doing through ETC, that in many ways the report doesn't really prove perhaps what it's going out of its way to try and improve. I think we're doing fine, but we need to spread that message, and I'm really grateful that we get the chance to do this, and the rest of you are all working really hard on that too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And for sure, I am so grateful that you are here, despite in what you said, that you all small farmers and agroecological peasants and farmers, you know, campesino in Mexico, where this landscape comes from, is a very good word for many of us in the rest of the world. I think you have done really important points on how important the contribution of small food producer peasants and campesinas are, and also, as you say, how we need to work with each other to see how we can defend this and support these people that are really feeling the most of us, the majority of the world. Before we go to the questions, we have several questions. We have many different questions. We will go to a panel with everyone. I will just give the floor shortly, like 5 minutes, to ETC Group's research director, which is Jim Thomas, that will make a few more clarifications points on the reports we are criticizing. Jim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will be very short. Thank you very much, Silvia, and good morning, everyone. I just thought I'd add a few more points about these two papers that we're looking at, the Ricciardi et al. Paper and the Lauder et al. Paper, just to spotlight some of the data gaps. The broad issues that Pat and others have named are exactly right about the framing, but I think it's also useful to point up some of the data gaps in these in how these reports have been put together. And, you know, in both cases, they create a model, but a model is only as good as what you put into it. The Ricciardi paper is the one I know better. And it's a model built on FAO, mostly FAO stats about production and other surveys that are done at the national level. And that in itself limits what sort of information is going into that model. But I think a really important, there's two limitations that should be kept in mind. Although it talks about feeding the world, the Ricciardi paper in particular only talks about crops. I think it talks about something like 154, 155 crop types, but it doesn't talk about livestock. It doesn't talk about eggs. It doesn't talk about milk. You know, many of the ways in which people get nutrition, even though it's framed in calories, are outside of the picture. So straight away, that is an issue. When I've talked with Naveen Ramankutty, who's actually one of the main authors there, he said yes, but 70% of food comes from vegetables, and that they did in fact somewhat count for livestock by tracking the grain that is fed to livestock. But of course, as we know, especially in peasant systems, a lot of livestock and animals are not fed on grains. They're pastoral, they're grazed, they're fed on scraps and so forth. So there's a large amount of the nutrition that people actually eat that isn't captured in that. And this is somewhat true also for the Lauder paper, which, although it does cover livestock and grains, does not cover things like fishing and hunting and so forth. Secondly, there's a really important data bias that I think is really important to point to, which is about geography. So the Ricciardi study claims to provide a global figure for how much food is produced by small farmers, which, as Pat has said, is only under 2 hectares, which is problematic to begin with. But it's even more problematic when you look at which countries they looked at. They looked at 55 countries. There are around 200 countries worldwide, so only about a quarter of all countries. And when you look at where those countries are, they're overwhelmingly in Europe or BRICS countries or the US. If I can just share my screen very quickly, I hope people can see this. You'll see that their data set overwhelmingly misses, it's overwhelmingly Europe, the US, and BRICS. It misses most of Asia, including China, which of course is a large part of the global population, but also where many of the world's small farms are. It misses most of Africa, and it almost entirely misses large parts of the Pacific and Asia. So this is a model that was built using data, formal FAO data, from places that do not have most of the world's peasants. Interestingly enough, the Ricciardi et al. Authors do recognize this, and they point to another study by Herrera et al., whose data is mostly from the global south, from peasant places. And they say using Herrera's data, using their methodology and Herrera's data, if you did that, you would find that something like that if you have a 5 hectares as the cutoff point, that you would have 76% of food being produced by small farmers with under 5 hectares, which of course is in exactly the same sort of 70%. So the fact that they chose to use very particular places where they had a lot of data, which is why they did it, but that do not reflect where small peasant farmers actually live, potentially really biased how this happened. And then the other thing I just wanted to touch on, which is about how they counted. Ricciardi et al. Counted in calories, and the Lauder paper counted in value. And particularly the idea of counting in value is very strange when you want to talk about feeding people. A lot of food doesn't enter the market. A lot of food, particularly peasant food and subsistence food, isn't by counting in value, you're not counting what feeds people, you're just counting what's sold, and that's a very different metric. I think there were some questions also about this question about whether they looked at waste. The Ricciardi paper did actually look at the question of wasted food, as in what went to animal feed, what went to biofuels, and they excluded that, but only up to a point. It doesn't deal with the waste that happens higher up the chain, the waste that happens at supermarkets, and it doesn't happen with the waste that happens in the household. I think FAO reckons that about 8% of food is wasted in the household. So there's a sense in which they dealt with waste, but also a sense in which they didn't. What they certainly didn't deal with is the waste, the amount of overfeeding of calories. You can have a large amount of calories produced by the industrial food chain, and if it goes to the same people over and over again, then it overfeeds, and that doesn't properly feed the world. And that question of both waste and the waste has to be addressed as well. Silvia, I hope that could be my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Shim. And I think it was useful to clarify what these reports were they miss. And as several of you pointed out, it seems very clear that this report, in a way, although they are partly based on some of the data we also have used, choose a way of presenting it and mischaracterized what our report said earlier, and including using earlier report, like the Ricciardi's paper refers to ETC's 2009 report, but not to the 2 updates that were later. So let's go, we have like half an hour for questions, and we have a lot of questions, and I will mention some of them. We have some questions that are of technical character about the what is taken in our studies or in the other studies, and that I will invite, for instance, Pat and Henk to answer, which is, for instance, from Anne-Marie Meyer, ask how is food waste factored in, or is it just production? And then we have Peter Goebbels saying it's not just production, but also consumption. Everyone who is eating, where does the food come from? I think that has been touched upon a little bit. That is 2 of the questions. There are more. We'll see if we can go to others. Then there is other kind of questions that I would like Henk to address, which is from David Newman, for instance, where he refers to biofuels, and he said most biofuels are collected by gatherers, not large farmers. In the 70s, 95% of the people in the world relied on wood, straw, and cow dung for domestic cooking, heating, and lighting. And to add to this, 34% of the greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the global food system, according to Kripa et al. Is a study published in 2001, from production to consumption, including processing, transport, and packaging. I think Henk may want to comment on that and relate to the reports you were referring to. And also we have another comment in the same vein, which says that the CO2 produced is small compared to the CO2 lost from the soil when the soil life gives up as the fertilizer is used. This is a question from Andy Johnson. Maybe we can take those. There is a set of concerns from several people about what are you going to do with this report, if a report is going to be, if we are going to do a counter report, and even if we are going to address FAO. I mean, all these are another set of questions, but maybe we can start with these more directed questions to Henk and Pat, and then go over to the three of you with the more general questions about what we can do. There is also a big concern that this kind of messages is also favoring a very dangerous tendency in the UK about promoting so-called gene-edited foods. But if we start in this order, is that okay? Pat, you have the floor.
Thanks, Silvia, and thanks, Jim, for those clarifications as well. That's all helpful, I think. And Ruth, it's really good to just bring it down to reality also. Just about in terms of responding to the report, I think that yes, a number of organizations have been talking in the last few weeks about the need to address, especially the FAO paper, since it's a position of a United Nations agency that we're concerned about. And I think that there'll be a letter shortly sent to the Director General of FAO questioning the studies and demanding clarifications of where is FAO going, what is its current policy now, and wanting to debate that. I think the issue is beyond FAO, of course. It really has to be addressed by something like the Committee on World Food Security, which is a much wider body in the United Nations system. And I think that should be, I think many of us feel that it should go there as well. But it's not just, again, challenging that report. There really is an issue about who will feed us in the future. It is what's coming up. It's the challenges ahead of us, and where will the resources go to make sure that we are food secure in the future. And that's, I think, the real task for us, is to understand that. We need to understand the strategies of the industrial food chain, and that's where the issue of waste comes in that you want us to address, Silvia, because the waste issue is quite wide. Jim has already said, the papers variously address it, but not fully address it. Waste can be described, and FAO has said this at different times, that between a third and even 40% of the world's food, and they really are talking about the industrial food chain, is actually wasted. It doesn't make it to people's stomachs at the end of the day. And it's lost all along the way, including at the household level, in especially in industrialized countries. Everybody who's looked at the waste issue acknowledges that there is more waste in the industrial food chain than there is in the peasant food web. There's very little that's actually wasted by peasants, that one way or another it gets plowed into the soil again, or it gets fed to livestock, or it doesn't get lost along the chain. It's a short supply chain. So it's more of an issue for the industrial food chain, and it's an important issue because the waste really is in several categories. It's not just the food that doesn't make it to our stomachs. It is also the food, as Jim said, that makes it to our stomachs, and about 25% of the food that shouldn't be eaten. We've overeaten that, and that's a damage. And then we look at the actual health and environmental damage of both the food that doesn't make it to the table and the food that shouldn't have made it to the table because it's not good for us. And we're talking about a cost, just in cash terms, we're talking about a cost in the industrial food chain that's well above $4.5 trillion per year, which is a huge amount of money that's wasted. And that's something we're experiencing now with the huge price increases of the last few months. This is a major issue for us, and in the future we can't have that kind of waste in terms of our resources, whether it's water or soil, or it's our financial resources. Subsidies are going into that industrial food chain, leading to that kind of waste. So we addressed those issues of the health and environmental damages, and FAO has done actually not a bad job a few years ago looking at those questions and showing the figures of health and environmental damages. Then it really changes how we look at the industrial chain and how we look at our future. Maybe Henk want to add to that, Henk, or do you have some other areas you wanted to touch on?
No, on the waste, I think it's clear what Jim and Pat were arguing. It's very clear that, as I understand it, in the FAO study, at least, the wasted food is, FAO recognizes there's a lot of waste, but in the calculations they had in this report, waste was not factored in a way. Perhaps what I could do is answer indeed the question about biofuels being locally used in many countries in the global south, like firewood, etc., etc. Of course, that's true. But I should have clarified that perhaps. I wasn't talking about those kind of biofuels. I was talking about commercial biofuels produced by, in commercial farming and in the commercial sector, produced for basically to run cars. So that, just to clarify that, because it is true. I mean, in general, that biofuel use as such isn't necessarily bad, especially if it's it's in the context of traditional livelihoods. But I wasn't referring to that sector of biofuels. I was referring to the industrial biofuels. I think it's important to clarify, and I should have done that in the beginning. The other question I think it was Andy, about the CO2 produced, the production of emissions by fertilizers. Indeed, there are several factors. The study I was mentioning calculates that in the production and transport of biofuels is about 40% of the emissions, and 60% of the emissions is happening when farmers apply it to the soil. When I think they also included that just 20% of the fertilizer actually makes it to the plants, and the vast majority ends up in the water and ends up polluting our water systems. But it's also true that because and I think the question referred to that because chemical fertilizers tend to break down organic matter in the soil, that also is an additional factor in producing greenhouse gases, because that organic matter, which should be in the soil, ends up in the air in the form of CO2. So that is correct. The one thing listening to the discussion, which we haven't really talked about, and which is probably obvious, but when Ruth talked about the support, the needed support for agroecological farming, for small farmers, etc. If you look at this sector, the large-scale industrial farming sector, which the FAO says feeds 70% of the world, how can it, apart from all the questions you already have, is you have to realize that there's a tremendous amount of subsidizing going on to keep that sector alive. There was a report by CITSA, I think, by the European development agencies, that came with tremendous figures about it. They basically concluded that most of the agricultural subsidies in the world, including in Europe, end up with the large farms who practice destructive farming, harmful for the environment and harmful for the people. So actually, this industrial farming system, and we don't realize that very often, wouldn't actually survive on its own. It needs the subsidies to continue, because then the subsidies also come in with the trade agreements, which subsidize in a way the trade flows. So you have to look at the industrial farming system as something which is not only unsustainable, but also economically not viable. It wouldn't survive with all the subsidies and all the specific policy measures which continue sustaining it.
I will invite Ruth to comment on that. Before that, I just wanted to say that in the attached to one of the questions, and also what Henk just said, that in the Who Will Feed Us report in 2017, we said that we made the calculation that for each dollar or pound or whatever you want that we pay for a product from the industrial food chain, we pay $2 in health and environmental costs, which is extremely relevant also when we are in a pandemic. We are communicating virtually because we cannot meet, because we are in a pandemic, that because of the, among other things, in the context, not because, but in the context of a pandemic of weakened immune system due to bad food and too much, not really nutritious food. And so what we are speaking about is extremely relevant from all points of views. Ruth, I think you were signaling you wanted to speak, and we certainly want to hear from you. Okay. and then go back to some of the questions that other participants made.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on a few points that have come up through our discussions, particularly around subsidies. I can really best speak to what happens in the UK, or what did used to happen under the Common Agricultural Policy. And in my travellings around and going to various conferences and group meetings and what have you, and talking to larger farmers, and they're talking about the transition to post-Brexit agriculture and how are they getting supported. And I've had larger farmers speak quite openly to me about the fact that if it wasn't for the fact that they were getting cap money, basically that's what they're living on. They're just about marginally making a profit from their grain or from anything else they're growing on their farm, and they're living on their subsidies. And of course the commodity buyers know that that's how they know, okay, so Jim's got 100 or 1,000 acres, he is therefore getting this much money, so therefore we can peg the price that we're going to give him for his commodities, knowing how much he needs to live on, and he doesn't need to live on these grain prices. So this middle ranking of farmers, or middle section of farmers, and some of them might still consider themselves small farmers, what's going to happen to them? We have potential payments for green activities on farms, more ecological activities on farms, which on the face of it looks great. But if we then have cheap imports coming in from America, and those farmers that were already marginally making a profit or not making a profit, some years yes, some years no, what happens to that middle rank? Of course, the lord of somewhere or other who's got hundreds of thousands of acres, he'll just carry on planting trees and get subsidy that way. And one more thing, the UK government made a delegated decision that any farmer under 5 hectares wasn't considered a proper farmer and would no longer get any area payments through the EU. That may change. It may be a case because I'm just under 5 hectares, like about 3 square inches under 5 hectares. It may well be that with the new support system, I may get paid for doing some of these environmental benefits and access to land, basically all the things I'm already doing already, but I was doing them because, I don't know, that's just the kind of thing that I do. But who knows whether, I'm not really that bothered, because I was just making a living out of growing food and feeding my community. I was doing farming, but the only way I can do that really is to do direct supply. If I was having to sell through a wholesaler, then I wouldn't be making a living. And of course, it's not all about money, but I have to pay my mortgage, I have to pay my workers, I pay my workers properly, as well as having trainees and volunteers and all sorts of other people on the farm. And just wanted, one thing about the waste, of course, on small farms, we do a lot of processing. So stuff that isn't directly saleable, we can ferment it, we can make it into pickles, chutneys, add value, increase our output, increase our income. And with around the fuels, 13 years ago, we planted a lot of windbreaks on the farm, and we've just started to harvest them for firewood, and we make biochar for soil amendments from the brash from the top. So, it's yeah, it all works together. Rather, it's often this case. It sounds, you sort of draw a picture of a model farm. How can it be? What's it? This is all too wonderful, and surely this can't really be true. But actually, it does work because these are old methodologies. We're building on knowledge that's come down to us through the centuries, and we can still do it. It's we have to have the confidence that we can actually feed people, and there's plenty of us around who are doing it, but we're doing it quietly. And because we're doing it, we don't get to go to Westminster and shout loudly enough. We're all far too nice and modest. We just need to tell people more about what we're doing. Aren't we amazing? But that's very difficult to say because that's not our characteristic. So thank you.
Well, recognizing the contribution of small-scale food providers is vital for everybody. It's some of the things that I always say. We are not speaking about you, like we are speaking about all of us. Why are we not all of us involved in this? And we are involuntarily paying $2 for damages and subsidizing transnational companies for their health and environmental damage.
So sorry.
Yeah, you can. And you can mention that Rockefeller Foundation said the same, not only at ETC Group.
But also the U.S. Department of Defense, its advanced research program has literally kind of drawn the same analysis of the industrial food chain as Grain and etc. Group and many others. In looking at the industrial chain, the defense industry in the United States is saying that it can't be trusted in the future, that the supply chain is too long, it is too complicated, and it's also rather almost absurdly too concentrated. And their biggest concern, in fact, is corporate concentration in agribusiness, which they believe makes the supply chain unreliable in the future. And so you have a major initiative by the U.S. Defense Department now trying to find out, looking for other ways to get around that supply chain and to bring, have shorter supply chains, much more decentralized than it is today. And we'd all probably share that that's all quite correct. It gets bad after that, unfortunately, as you can always expect with the Department of Defense, and that their conclusion is that they should simply develop microbes that can do things, and we can just have microbes in our basement that will grow all our food for us, and that's perhaps the best result. Or they even conclude that they can extract it from the air. They'll find ways to get molecules from the air and turn that into food for everybody, and everyone will have their own molecular farm somehow in the sky. It gives you a whole new dimension to the idea of pie in the sky. But sorry, I'll do that.
Sorry, the only reason why I'm interrupting you is because we have around 10 minutes and then we have to cut. And there are many questions about what we can do. There are questions about, are we going to write an answer or a report about, just answering these studies? Are we going to touch at FAO directly? And also there is a question from Peter Brooks wondering if the authors or the funding of the reports that we are contesting here have any links to agribusiness companies, think tanks, or similar. That was a concrete question. But because we have very little time, I would like that we focus on what we can do to counter these reports, and what we maybe mention what we already are doing to counter these reports and to address FAO. Nora, hi, Nora. Nora McKeown, thanks for asking that. I think it's important to share that we definitely need to address FAO on this report. So maybe you can comment on these strategies for the next minutes. And I see that there are also many other important questions, like for instance from Hazel about which other studies includes fisherfolk, and if we have a global figure about how much of the industrial food system feed humans directly. I would invite the people that didn't get an answer to their questions, now that we have too many more than time, to reach out to us or to the organizers, and so we can continue the answering on the discussion and pass on the questions to Pat, Henk, etc. So I will now leave the floor to you three again to answer this about the more strategic questions about these reports and how we can continue recognizing and defending the peasants well.
Why doesn't Henk take that one on initially for grain?
Okay, now I think, I don't know who mentioned it, perhaps with you, Silvia. Yes, we are, with a number of organizations, we are responding to the FAO report. And we're still working on it, but it's by next week or the week after, we will send a letter to the FAO with all the issues and the concerns that we have highlighted and outlined in this conversation. I think it would be great if, as a way to follow up, is to draw it to share this letter. We will make it public. We'll put it on our website, etc. But that all our organizations actually pick up this that material and this letter, and which will be accompanied by a background document which explains a bit the issues, and that in each organization this issue is being brought up and is being distributed as well. Because I think the most effective strategy we can have is to make this shift in the FAO, as I see it, in their thinking about large-scale farming and against small-scale farming, to make that public and to get it in the open there. Because that's we don't even expect perhaps that FAO will answer our letter, but the more in the public there is awareness and there's debate about how these new narratives are being framed towards large-scale farming, the more we can do that, the better. So I think that's something I would call upon everybody here to use that material and to use it in your own work, in your own organizations.
And along with the letter to FAO, there will be background papers as well available to on our websites that people will be able to look at to get more detail, of course, than simply a letter to FAO.
So Ruth, do you want to comment anything on strategies?
Yeah, well, I could very easily put in a plug for joining the Land Workers Alliance. We do a lot of lobbying around agroecology, the benefits of, as well as our grassroots skill sharing and social networks. So yeah, and we've had quite a lot of effect in the last 5 or 6 years. We now get spoken to. We now get input into government strategy and reports. Obviously not enough, but yeah, we do get some, and the more people who join with us and add your voice, then brilliant. Please do that.
I would like to mention one more question that is here that I haven't taken before, which is that both David Newman and Peter Brooks has addressed if we think that this is also a kind of neo-colonial thinking. And I think that Peter Brooks answered, and I totally agree with that the report submission of peasant farming seems parallel to the colonial tradition of mapping and using mapping to erase indigenous practice and places of living. And this is exactly what happened, for instance, with the Ricciardi report, where many places where farmers and small farmers are living are not taken into consideration. So it's not only about the way of using this, but it's also ignoring or trying to erase in a way the contribution of peasant farmers. I think that in contrary to what Henk said about not waiting for FAO's answer, yes, we do wait a lot for FAO's answers, and we really want FAO to react on that. How can they be announcing a report as nothing that is asking to subsidize more than it's already done to the industrial food chain? So they have to really answer to that. But besides that, I totally agree that what we need most is something that we all can use, because we are flooded with information from both media and other parts that really invisibilize the contribution of peasants, campesinas and campesinos, but also all these other what we call food providers, including urban growers, that many people in the world has to be today, because they have been pushed out by large plantations and large monocultures and so. And also it has been slightly mentioned the contribution to climate change, but when we put them together, the industrial food chain basically is heavily related to all the major crises in our time, to the health crisis, to the environmental crisis, to the climate crisis. And here we have a paper that says the people that are trying to stop this and to produce in a different way, they are the ones that shouldn't be supported. We want more support for the people that are behind the largest crisis we are living in today. So I think I will thank everybody for being here today, and particularly to the Oxford, the organizers or the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And it's so welcome that we can speak on real farming here, and the farming we need now, the one and the farm we will need. I also want to extend a particular thank to Coati, which is the interpreters that help us today, and also mention that Coati is an autonomous collective that organized translation with a lot of volunteers and has helped a lot of movements to communicate, not only in this kind of conference, but also in in-person conferences. So I thank everybody, the volunteers, the organizers, the interpreters, and I think this conference is over. And please look for our contacts if you have further questions that we couldn't address in this session. I will just leave it for a second so you can see the contact emails, or you can reach us through the conference. Thank you very much.